Hello and welcome back. This is the week 2 lecture. So today I would like us to finish the narrative of Cabeza de Vaca. Last week we covered roughly the first half of the book. I asked you guys to read up until around page 100. And the reason we stopped in that general area is because some very important changes occur right around that point. Some very important changes in this journey that Cabeza de Vaca is experiencing. So we'll talk about those changes. We'll talk about some of the fluctuations in his social status as he kind of bounces around between different groups of Native Americans in coastal Texas. So remember, we left off last time shortly after they shipwreck on the island of Mojado, which is in the Galveston Bay, off the coast of modern day Texas. So they've endured this harrowing journey along the Gulf Coast of several modern-day U.S. states. They've survived on these open rafts. A bunch of men have been lost. The rafts have been separated. But Cabeza de Vaca, along with a group of other survivors, they've ended up on this island of Mojado, which literally translates to the Isle of Ill Fortune. And we left off last time talking about the fact that Cabeza de Vaca has become a slave. He has come into the possession of one of these Native American groups, and they are basically using him for slave labor. But we also notice that his situation soon changes. He's able to fall in with a different group of Native Americans in this same general area of coastal Texas, and he becomes a merchant, as he tells us around, I think, page 97. So quite a reversal. He goes from describing the process of picking roots, like pulling up roots with his bare hands underwater. His hands are bleeding. It's brutal work. He's naked. He's tired. He's treated very badly. And then right after that, he's a merchant. And he seems to have a lot more freedom. He's sort of traveling between different groups, selling wares. So it's weird, right? Because he doesn't really describe the nature of these various transactions. He's not really explaining how he's able to go from being a slave with one group to then being a merchant with another group. But one thing that becomes clear, even though he doesn't necessarily explain this very well, one thing that becomes clear to us is that his fate is really dependent on the groups that he's with. So some of these groups are friendly to the survivors of the Narvaez expedition, but other groups are not. So towards the end of the week 1 lecture, I mentioned that there are some groups that help them on the island of Mojado, arguably save their lives, right? Because the Spaniards lose most of their supplies. They're always short on food and water. They're naked. They don't know where they are. They're going through a lot of difficulties. So they're kind of kept alive initially by some of these tribes on Mojado. And Cabeza de Vaca begins to describe these different groups, some of their cultural practices. He starts to offer more information than he did back on the Florida Peninsula. So I hope you're noticing that change. Early in the expedition, he doesn't give us a lot of detail about the Native Americans that they encounter beyond the fact that the Spanish can't really communicate with them back in Florida. And he really kind of fixates on those native tribes' abilities with the bow and arrow. But that makes sense. I mean, he really fixates on how good they are at archery. But that matters to the Spanish because they're constantly in conflict with those Native American groups. So one of the key characteristics that Cabeza de Vaca wants to really emphasize is that these people were really good at shooting bow and arrows, and they killed a lot of us in that fashion. But beyond that and some really basic physical descriptions, he doesn't offer a ton of ethnographic detail about some of those tribes they encounter in Florida. But now, later in the journey, he's beginning to offer more detail. So remember one of those questions I asked last week. How are we going to categorize or classify this narrative? We know that it belongs to certain well-established genres. So we already know that it's an example of an expedition narrative, or you might prefer to call it a conquest narrative. We know that. We also know that it is a letter of relation. It is an official account written by a member of the expedition and intended for a royal audience back in Spain. And I mentioned the primary purpose, the primary function that this text is supposed to serve, and it's very simple. Cabeza de Vaca is supposed to relay information. He's supposed to deliver valuable information to the Spanish king. So just going back very quickly to that letter that he begins with on page 44, just notice what he's emphasizing. He's emphasizing that he can deliver valuable info that might help future colonizing missions. But he offers a few specific examples of what he can provide. So he mentions, quote, the location of the lands, the distances among them, information on foodstuffs and animals, and then finally, the diverse customs of the many and barbarous peoples with whom I conversed and lived. So in the second half of the narrative, we're going to see a bigger emphasis on that final thing that he lists there. He's going to start providing a lot more detail about the different Native American groups that they live with, that they flee from, that they interact with at various times throughout the second half of the book. So we mentioned ethnography last time, and we might notice that we're seeing more ethnography in the second half of the narrative, although we did see some in the first half. I think we're going to see larger amounts as we continue to proceed. And just a reminder, ethnography is a term taken from anthropology, and I'm using the term kind of loosely. So actually, I think what Cabeza de Vaca is doing here would be better described as ethnology. I might be getting confused here. I'm no anthropologist, but I think ethnography is cultural information compiled by a member of the culture that's being studied or written about. But I think when an outsider compiles information about a culture, I think that's actually called ethnology. And that's what Cabeza de Vaca is doing. He's sort of observing and at times speculating, but he's trying to capture as much information about these native cultures as he possibly can as he observes them, interacts with them, and oftentimes lives with them, as we'll see in a moment. So, but he is still an outsider. So I think actually he's an ethnologer, or what he's doing is ethnology. If a native was providing personal perspective or direct experience, that might be more what we would consider in modern times to be ethnography. I think often ethnology will be a collection of personalized accounts taken from members of the culture. So, and ethnology might be a collection of individual ethnographies. But that doesn't really matter so much for us because this is not an anthropology class. But I just wanted to let you guys know that we're using ethnography in kind of a broad way, in kind of a general way, and anthropologists might not love it. Also, the term transculturation, which I mentioned last week, this idea of cultural melding, or different cultures colliding, but also sort of combining, exchanging, and perhaps in the process creating some kind of new hybrid culture. That's another concept taken from anthropology. We don't need to be experts in these areas. We just need to have a general idea of what those terms mean. All right, so let's pick up where we left off last time. So remember, we're in coastal Texas, and Cabeza de Vaca has fallen in with a couple of different groups, and these groups seem to be traveling back and forth from Mojado to the mainland. These are sort of hunter-gatherer societies, so they're often in pursuit of food. They're following food sources. So their travel seems to be seasonal. They spend certain parts of the year on Mojado, and then they spend other parts of the year on the Texas mainland. But they're always pretty close to the water. So what we notice is that Cabeza de Vaca is obviously not the only survivor who's in this general area. Other Spaniards also landed on Mojado, and this includes some guys that we're going to get to know a little bit later. So I mentioned the fellow survivors, the other three survivors of the expedition that end up reunited with Cabeza de Vaca, and then the four of them will sort of participate in this next phase of the journey. So I've already mentioned these guys: Castillo, Dorantes, and Estevancio, an African slave probably from modern-day Morocco, which likely means that he was probably a practicing Muslim and he probably spoke Arabic, but we don't know that much about his life. I believe he belonged to Castillo. He belonged to either Castillo or Dorantes. We're going to talk a lot more about him because he becomes quite important in the second half of the narrative. But those three guys are in the same general area, and there's some other survivors still remaining at this point. But what we learn are between like pages, I think like 95 and 100, Cabeza de Vaca is sort of separated from his other fellow survivors. And he tells us that while he's on the mainland with one of these native groups, he falls ill. He becomes very sick, and we don't know exactly what's wrong with him, but it's a pretty debilitating illness, and he's not able to travel back to Mojado. So it seems like at this point he's kind of stranded on the mainland, and he becomes isolated from the other survivors because those other survivors are living with other Native American groups. So it's kind of complicated, and again, Cabeza de Vaca does not always provide a wealth of detail or explanation. So we don't always know exactly how they're passing back and forth between different groups. But it's fair to speculate that at some points they're being sold as slaves. We know that Dorantes at one point is kept as a slave by the same group that's keeping Cabeza de Vaca. So at certain points these guys are slaves, but then it seems like when they fall in with different groups, maybe friendlier groups, they're often treated better, and they're given opportunities to serve different roles in those local societies. So it seems like the Mariames is one of the more hostile groups in this area, and it seems like whenever Cabeza de Vaca finds himself with them, that means he's enslaved. But then he falls in with, I believe it's the Charucos around page 97, and I think it's with them that he becomes more of a merchant. He's able to attain a higher position in that particular culture or that particular tribal society. So this is all very weird, and as readers, we don't understand all of it, and it's fair to say that Cabeza de Vaca probably also did not understand all of it. So he's only giving us maybe the information that he really has. But they are changing. They're experiencing a lot of reversals in their social standing. But if you look over on page 98, there's a really helpful footnote on that page because Cabeza de Vaca is telling us that he basically lives alone amongst various native tribes for a period of what he thinks is 6 years. But the footnote corrects him and clarifies that it was actually probably closer to 4.5 years, from sometime in 1529 to some point in 1533. So even though he's overestimating the amount of time that he's separated from his other Spaniards, still 4.5 years, according to the editors in that footnote, 4.5 years of him living alone amongst Native Americans is still pretty noteworthy. We should definitely think about that a little bit. And again, he's alternately mistreated and treated pretty well, depending on his circumstances during this period. But again, he knows that other Spaniards are in this general region of coastal Texas, but there are times where he has very little freedom of movement. So it seems like at times he's very restricted in terms of where he can go and what he can do. And then at other times, perhaps when he's working as a merchant, he's able to travel and sort of meet up with people. But he doesn't see these other survivors again for a period of 4.5 years. So that's important to note. But he has some other interactions. I think not during that 4.5 year period, but maybe right after. We hear about the guy who's stranded on Mojado. This guy has the same last name as the historian Oviedo, who I mentioned last time. Remember, Oviedo wrote a history about this expedition based on the joint account that Cabeza de Vaca wrote along with Dorantes and Castillo after all three of them returned to Spain years after they were rescued. So Oviedo's history is often used to cross-check a lot of the facts presented in our 1542 edition of this narrative that we're reading here. So this is a different Oviedo. This is Lope de Oviedo, who's on this island. He's trying to meet up with Cabeza de Vaca, but he can't swim. I think he gets stuck on the island, and we don't know what happens to him. He probably dies. What you're noticing is we are getting pieces of information slowly about what happens to some of the other survivors of the rafts. We kind of find out where some of these other people ended up, but there's no record of any other survivors of the expedition ever making it back to Spanish civilization outside of our core group of four. Our guys, Cabeza de Vaca, Dorantes, Castillo, and Estevancia. So if some of these other guys survived in like coastal Louisiana or coastal Texas, they either didn't live very long, or they just stayed where they were. They stayed living amongst those Native American groups, and they never returned to, Spanish settlement. The only guys that we know did return are the four guys that we're going to be following for the rest of the book. So just keep that in mind. Remember, at the beginning of the expedition, there were hundreds of people. And by roughly the point where we're at now, we're down to 4. But we do learn more about some of these survivors. So that brings me to another thing that I wanted to point out here. And I actually talked about this in the week 1 module. That might have been a little bit early, but I did want to talk about structure, because something weird happens right around page 101. And we have a change in Cabeza de Vaca's narration style. So the editors talk about this in the intro, and then I talk about it in the week 1 module. So hopefully you guys are familiar with this shift. It doesn't occur for a very long period of time, but this is an important change to be aware of. So up until page 101, Cabeza de Vaca has been using a very straightforward first-person narration style. And it's been pretty easy to understand for the most part. But once we get to page 101, he does a weird thing. He starts to recount things that happened to Dorantes and Castillo and other survivors. But he himself did not experience most of the events that he's narrating between page 101 and page 106. So there's actually a footnote on page 106. Once again, the editors are helping us out, and they tell us in that footnote that that's the point there on page 106 where Cabeza de Vaca's narrative of Dorantes and Castillo's account ends rather subtly. They say it subtly ends here on page 106. And what they mean is Cabeza de Vaca never really makes it clear that what he's been narrating for the previous 5 pages are experiences that he did not participate in. Because remember, he was separated from those guys for a period of 4.5 years. So he is eventually reunited with them. And that actually happens, I believe, on page 100. He finally meets up with those guys again after all this time. And they've given him up for dead. they're surprised, they're shocked to see him because they just assumed he had been dead for a long time. So kind of a dramatic moment, but in his inimitable way, Cabeza de Vaca sort of just glosses over it. He doesn't really develop it for drama. Again, as we mentioned last week, he's not a fiction writer. But right after that critical sort of reuniting scene, right after that, he shifts gears and he starts to relay information that Dorantes and Castillo told him. But now he's delivering secondhand info. He's no longer providing that personal testimony that we talked about last week. So most of this narrative, right, the overwhelming majority of this narrative does come directly from his own experience. But for this 5-page section, he shifts into more of a third-person narration style, even though he doesn't make it abundantly clear. He shifts into a third person so he can relate what happened to these other guys while he was separated from them. So remember his larger purpose. He's trying to deliver information. So part of that means he has to account for what happened to as many members of the expedition as possible. So this is part of his official responsibility as treasurer of the Narvaez expedition. He has to try to tie up some of these loose ends. And he learns a lot about what happened to some of these other survivors. He learns a lot from Castillo and Dorantes. And Estevancio is there too, but as we notice, he doesn't always directly acknowledge Estevancio as much as he probably should, and he also very seldom refers to him by name. He usually just refers to Estevancio as the black man. And we'll talk more about some of the reasons for that, but Estevancio, I would argue, becomes really important later in the narrative. But at this point, he's mostly just focusing on his fellow white Spaniards, Castillo and Dorantes. But remember, Estevancio's there too, and he'll be there with these guys for the duration. He'll be there for the remainder of the narrative. Those four, beginning around page 112 and beyond, those four stay together for the rest of the narrative. They don't get separated again. So I think around page 112, by that point, they are fleeing down the coast. They are fleeing south because they're beginning to realize that a lot of these tribes in coastal Texas are pretty warlike and they're hostile and they don't have a very favorable impression of these Europeans. So they want to get out of this general area. They have found some friendly groups, but by and large, the living is difficult here. There's not an abundance of, fresh water sources on the mainland. Food is sometimes short. And again, we notice that these are hunter-gatherer type societies. They don't have permanent settlements. They don't really have established towns or villages like we saw back in Florida, in the panhandle of Florida near Appalachian. And we'll see more permanent settlements later. But we're not really seeing them here in coastal Texas. These are groups that follow their food sources, they're semi-nomadic, and they're quite warlike. They're often at conflict with one another, as Cabeza de Vaca notes. So eventually the four survivors are like, let's get out of here. We're tired of being periodically enslaved. So they decide to head south, kind of following the coastline. And pretty soon, they start to encounter different native groups. And this is where a lot of these changes that I mentioned begin to occur. So they escape from the Mariames, who again seem to be one of the principal hostile groups in this area. And again, we get some interesting detail. And if you go back to page 101, I believe it is, by that point, Cabeza de Vaca is a lot more straightforward about being enslaved. He's very explicit. He actually uses the term slave, which he did not do back on page 90, where we first get the sense that he is being enslaved, but he's kind of circumspect. He's kind of vague about the way he describes it. He just says, I was in the possession of this other guy. But here he uses the term slave on page 101, and I think he and Dorantes are both slaves of the Mariames at that point. But earlier, he narrates passages of escape. They're pursuing him at various times. So like I mentioned before, we can think of this as kind of an adventure narrative because there are a lot of staples that we would recognize from contemporary action or adventure stories, action movies even. I always think about the raft journey as being very well suited to a cinematic treatment, but also what's going on in coastal Texas, these various escapes, the hardships, the drastic fluctuations in their fortunes. All of that makes for pretty good sort of action-based material. But what you'll notice is once they head further south and they start to approach the modern-day U.S.-Mexico border, everything changes. The Native Americans change. The cultures and the societies that they're encountering change. Their positions change. But also, just the whole nature of the narrative changes. There's a little bit less obvious action. There's less running and shipwrecks and death and fighting. That was all very prevalent in the first half of the narrative, but as we continue on this journey, a lot of those traditional action elements go away. Because once they get down into Mexico, a lot of the conflict goes away. They're no longer in danger. They're no longer running for their lives. They're no longer enslaved. They're still experiencing a few hardships, but without question, their situation improves as their journey continues. But a lot of weird stuff starts to happen that we have to make sense of. So again, they sort of escape from the Mariames and they start moving down the coast around page 112. And soon they encounter a new group of natives that they refer to as the Avivares. And they're in what's called the prickly pear region by this juncture. So if you kind of go back to some of the maps they give you on page 38, page 39, you can get a general idea of where they are now. They're getting down near the Rio Grande, the river that forms much of the border, the modern day border between the U.S. and Mexico. So what's interesting to note, and we'll talk more about geography in part 2 of today's lecture, but they are actually kind of on the way to Panuco. Remember, the whole point of this expedition was to get to what is now northeastern Mexico, to sort of explore beyond the northernmost limit of Spanish settlement in what is now Mexico. So they're aiming for somewhere in the modern-day state of Tamaulipas, a little bit north of Panuco, but of course they end up on the wrong side of the Gulf near modern-day Tampa Bay in the state of Florida. So just one thing I wanted to mention last week and forgot about, but I did mention it in the week 1 module. There's 2 different uses of Florida at work in this book, and I think they explained this in the intro. Hopefully you guys understand. When they use the word Florida italicized, they're referring to this huge area north and east of Mexico that the Spanish were trying to explore. They hadn't mapped that whole area. Basically, they were trying to figure out the continent of North America, but they hadn't gotten very far. So they referred to everything that was north and east of Mexico as Florida. So don't be confused. The Narvaez expedition was intended to explore Florida, but that Florida, the italicized Florida, that refers to that vast, unmapped geographical region. But instead of going to northeastern Mexico and then continuing in a north and eastern direction, instead they ended up in the modern-day state of Florida. So when the editors are referring to the modern-day state, the peninsula only, they don't italicize the word Florida. So if it's italicized, you know they mean that vast geographical region that they were supposed to be exploring. But one of the bizarre ironies of this text is they do explore parts of that vast, unexplored geographical area. And if you look at the map, you'll notice that as they continue to head south down the Gulf Coast near Mexico, approaching Mexico, they're actually headed in the right direction. If they keep following the coastline, they would eventually reach the River of the Palms, the Rio de las Palmas, and Panuco. But they're still not really clear on where they are, and they will make a change to their route pretty soon. So we'll talk more about that later. But so again, everything is changing for them as they approach Mexico. And once they fall in with the Avares, one of the Avavares, one of the interesting things that occurs is they begin to function as healers. So we have to talk about this, and this is very complex. And this is one of the potential sources of transculturation that a lot of scholars and critics talk about. But the Avavares are friendly. They're very friendly to the survivors, and they live amongst the Avavares in this prickly pear region for a little while. And their social position is changing. They're no longer enslaved. They're no longer mistreated. Instead, the Avavares perceive them as possessing some kind of medical or spiritual or perhaps even mystical abilities. So if you guys think back, we actually got a preview of this on Mojado. It's back on Mojado where they are first asked to sort of serve as doctors, to use our modern day vocabulary. They're first asked to kind of heal people, which would be a job typically handled by shamans or medicine men in these various tribal social networks. But they're called upon to do it because they're foreign, they're weird, they're different. And we do start to learn, especially once we get to Mexico, that according to certain spiritual or religious practices amongst these native groups, we get the feeling that the Spaniards are perceived as maybe being supernatural, or at least being sort of unique and potentially in possession of great powers. It doesn't really seem like a lot of the coastal groups in Texas feel that way. They're not really all that impressed by these naked Spaniards. But again, the perception of them changes as their journey continues. So the Avavares are very friendly to them, but they want them to function as healers. And if you remember back on Mojado, when they're first asked to do this, and this is a different group, it's not the Avavares, it's a different tribe back on Mojado who basically forced them. Because if you remember, their first reaction to being asked to do this, they're kind of skeptical and almost disdainful. They're dismissive. They kind of mock the natives, and they're like, we're not doctors, we're not healers, we're not capable of doing that. That's crazy to think that we could do that. And they're very dismissive. But then I think it becomes clear that if they don't do what they're being told to do, they're not going to eat. So again, they're not in control. They're not in charge anymore. The expedition is long gone. So they're at the mercy of the tribes that they're living with. So back on Mojado, they're like, okay, we don't have a choice. So they kind of start doing it there, working as healers. But it doesn't seem like they're doing it really consistently until they get down to the land of the prickly pears, down there near the Rio Grande. And this is when things really take a turn for them. Once they start working as healers, everything gets a lot better for them. And they notice that they're beginning to, achieve a little bit of recognition. And they're developing a little bit of a reputation because people think that they are successful. They are apparently helping people with their sicknesses or with their injuries. So this is very strange, and we have to kind of navigate all of that. We'll talk more about it in part 2 of this lecture. So a few other things I want to point out in this general area of the narrative. Look on page 115. This is a really important scene. It seems to have a lot of symbolic importance, and it's rare for Cabeza de Vaca because we get possible symbolism, we get a biblical reference, we get a little bit more pizzazz here than we typically get with his narrative. So if you look on page 115, at this point, I think they're running with the Avivares, but and they're sort of living with them. But Cabeza de Vaca gets lost in the desert at night, and he's sort of wandering, and he comes across a burning bush or a tree aflame, and it warms him. This is clearly a biblical reference, and a lot of scholars have done some interesting work with it. So again, I believe, this is page 115. And I want you guys to sort of figure out what you think is going on here. Is he intentionally evoking the Bible with this scene? A lot of people read this as a pretty obvious parallel to that famous scene from the Bible, from Exodus, where Moses is being appointed by God to lead the Israelites out of Egypt back to their homeland. So a lot of people think, okay, Cabeza de Vaca is being very intentional here. He wants us to think of him as a Moses-like figure who is leading his fellow Spaniards out of captivity back home to, Spanish settlement and eventually Spain. And that could be. I mean, certainly it seems like an intentional reference. And he's obviously very religious, so he knows the Bible pretty well. So you could definitely make that case. However, I think things are a little bit more complicated here. And at this point in the narrative, they're not really in captivity anymore. Cabeza de Vaca and the other survivors, they're not slaves anymore. They're not pulling up those roots back in Galveston Bay. So I don't know if it's quite so easy as simply labeling him Moses and saying that they're being led out of captivity, because really their circumstances have changed. But remember, he's presenting himself in a particular way for the king. Remember his audience. So maybe he does have some intentionality here, but he also might just be describing what he saw. And maybe he really saw that, and he's just sticking to his primary function here as a truth teller, as a documenter, somebody who's simply writing down what he experienced, providing information for the crown. So you get to decide. But like I said, what happens soon after is really fascinating as the four survivors become healers. And also, I want to talk more about the following that they gain. Everything really becomes quite bizarre. But in some ways, kind of interesting and cool as well. And if we're looking for transculturation, we might be able to find it in part 2 of this lecture. But just a few other things I wanted to point out. Again, look over on page 118 to think a little bit more about their role as healers, because this is really complicated and it's really hard for modern readers to figure out what exactly is going on here. Is this whole thing sort of a sham? Are they sort of misleading people or tricking people into thinking that they're actually curing them when they're not in reality? It's really unclear. And remember, the Spaniards themselves are very skeptical at first. They're like, oh, we can't do this. But then later they seem to accept their role, and they don't seem to be protesting anymore. And again, they're meeting with some success. A lot of the natives claim to feel better after being treated by the Spaniards. So there's a footnote on page 118 where they explain this concept from anthropology, once again, sort of a psychological tendency that might explain what's going on here. They're probably not very medically talented, but if the natives are expecting them to be, if the natives expect them to effect cures, then that could account for why the natives feel better afterward. So if the natives are expecting healers, then they perceive these men to be healers, essentially, right? So the question is, are they actually great shamans because they perform cures, or are they performing cures because the natives perceive them as great shamans. And as we'll see, their reputation really starts to precede them. People seek them out. People have heard about them. They sort of achieve some local fame as their journey continues. So you got to sort of navigate all of that. And also notice on page 119 what Cabeza de Vaca says about his own healing skills. Again, he's very concerned about the way he presents himself in this narrative. So he tells us near the bottom of the page, we all became physicians, although in boldness and daring to perform any cure, I was the most notable among them. So he's saying, yeah, we all did it, but I was the best. Another really interesting thing happens right after that, at the very bottom of page 119, and it continues over to page 120. Really interesting, really strange, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it next week, because here we see an example of a Native American folktale that gets told to the Spaniards, and then Cabeza de Vaca is relating it here in his narrative for the benefit of the king and any other readers. So we're going to be reading more Native American folktales next week and talking about them in a lot more depth. But I want you to notice what's happening here. So at the very bottom of 119, this tale begins, and this local group, I believe this might be the Avavares at this point. I get a little mixed up with all the different groups, and as we'll also notice, Cabeza de Vaca stops naming them very soon. But I think we're still with the Avavares at this point, and they're telling this story. And we're going to recognize it next week as a pretty familiar example of a trickster narrative. Now, this gets complicated because the whole notion of a trickster functioning in Native American folklore was really coined by white anthropologists and historians. Some Native Americans will claim that the trickster is really an invention of white people, and we don't quite understand it the way it functions in traditional Native American folktales, and that's probably true. But just in terms of the labels that we use, the genres that we use, and there's even a footnote telling you this is a trickster tale that the Spaniards are hearing. So pay attention to the story itself. It doesn't take long. It's kind of spooky and mysterious. But I also want you to notice the reaction of Cabeza de Vaca and his companions. Notice how they respond to the story. They're frankly quite dismissive. And as Cabeza de Vaca even tells them in his own words, we laughed a great deal about those things. About those things they told us, making fun of them. That's his phrase. They were making fun of the natives after hearing that tale. So this is another example of something I mentioned last week. Cabeza de Vaca and the other Spaniards sort of using European precedent, European standards and values to evaluate these new cultures, these new social practices that they were encountering. So they do that again here, because if you turn over to 121, you'll notice that after they get done laughing and making fun of the natives, they basically tell the natives, hey, they kind of interpret the story for the natives, which is kind of interesting. And the Spaniards say, look, this trickster guy, this evil guy that you're describing, he's an evil person. He might be the devil, but you don't have to worry about him, because if you believe in our Savior, Jesus Christ, if you're a good Christian like us, you'll be protected from the kinds of evil practiced by figures like the one you're describing. And according to Cabeza de Vaca, again, we get to decide if we believe him here, but according to him, this response actually reassures the natives. So after having some Christian concepts explained to them, they apparently feel better about this scary guy that they were telling the tale about. Now, do I buy that was their reaction? Maybe. I think it's probably a lot more complicated than what we're seeing here. But this is an example of something that Cabeza de Vaca will also do later. towards the end of the narrative, when he's making the case that a lot of these natives that they encountered on their journey would make good candidates for conversion. They would be good candidates to be converted to Christianity. So even here, he's kind of laying the groundwork, almost suggesting that these natives are very open to Christian ideas. They're very open to some of these European cultural practices that we're exposing them to. They just need a little bit more teaching, and maybe they would adopt more of our ways. He's going to return to that idea later. I think he's sort of hinting at it here. But this is one of those moments, again, where we have to remember that he has this larger purpose, not just of delivering information, but as we'll see by the end of the book, he has his own views. He has his own theory about how the Spanish should sort of deal with all of these Native Americans in what is now Mexico. He has his own ideas about the relationships that they should establish and the type of governance that they should exercise. So a lot of the information that he's relating to the king probably has the purpose of supporting and reinforcing his own personal views. And I think we'll be able to make more sense of that as we move along. So that's pretty much it for part one, but of this lecture. We're going to do a part one and a part two. But just the final thing I want to do before stopping, move over to page 130. This is kind of an important moment in the narrative because he offers a really detailed, carefully constructed catalog of basically all the Native American groups that they've encountered between Mojado and the Prickly Pear region of the Rio Grande. So this is interesting because this is the last time he does this. So there's actually a footnote back on page 124 that tells you that from this point on, from like the region of the prickly pears onward, he doesn't really name any of the other tribes that he and his companions encounter. Which is very strange because he's had a real mania for naming back in coastal Texas. He wanted to name all of these different groups on Mojado, the groups that would cross back and forth from the island to the mainland. They continued to name some tribes as they continued to move south. But once they kind of cross over into Mexico, he very abruptly stops naming tribes. And of course, remember, there were no borders back then. I mean, nowadays, the Rio Grande is the border. But back then, there was no border. But once they cross into modern day Mexico, he stops providing names. Now, he continues to offer ethnographic details, but no names. And we don't really know why. We don't know why he stops. There are some theories. And as we'll see in part two of this lecture, he encounters such different cultures, such different social structures, and such so many larger population centers that frankly, I think it becomes harder for him to differentiate between different tribes, different groups. There seems to be more of a lingua franca down in Mexico where that allows a lot of the different groups to still be able to communicate with one another. So some of the clear distinctions between tribes that he notices in the more sparsely populated areas of coastal Texas, like a lot of that stuff goes away as their journey continues. And I think he struggles to identify distinct groups. But he continues to tell us more and more about cultural practices. He'll continue to tell us about what they eat, how they work, how they interact, in some cases what they smoke, their labor practices, right? He gets into a lot of detail, but he stops providing names. So after page 130, he will not name any more groups. So just keep that in mind. All right, so I'm going to stop part one here, and then we'll pick up in part two at the point where they, cross over into Mexico and their fame as healers continues to spread.